deceive us. I'll come back to that in a moment, but I'd also like to point out that it may seem I'm discussing some things that there are surprising things you find in the Qur'an taken from ancient times, but there are surprising things found that have to do with our modern times. That is, the Qur'an is not an old problem, it's still a problem today. You have the interesting statement, for example, that it is the unbelievers who would take note of the fact that in the beginning the heavens and the earth were one piece, that all life is made of water. Well, that's what they awarded the 1973 Nobel Prize for. A couple of unbelievers talked about the origin of the universe, how it began from one piece, which they keep verifying till now. That life is made of water is probably wouldn't have been a very easy thing to convince people of 14 centuries ago. If you stood in the desert and told somebody, you see this is made of water, mostly it's water. That had to wait for the invention of the microscope to find out that cytoplasm, the basic substance of the cells, is 80% water. I mentioned falsification tests, chances to prove the Qur'an is incorrect. Some of those stand there just like the challenge to Abu Lahab. Some of them stand there today. In fact, you have an interesting ayah which says, speaking of the relationship not between individual people, but between groups of people. It's saying, as a group, in effect, it says the Christians will treat you nicer than the Jews treat you. It tells the Muslims that, as a group. Now, I say there have been a lot of Christians and a lot of Jews who have become Muslims, but as groups of people, this will generally be the case according to the Qur'an. Do you realize what that is? That's a chance for the Jews to prove that the Qur'an is false. All they have to do is get organized and treat the Muslims nicely for a few years. And then say, what does your book say about who is your best friend in the world? But I mean, really, who treats you the nicest? The Jews or the Christians? Look what we Jews did for you. That's all they have to do. They haven't done it yet. But it stands there as a challenge saying, you want to prove it's wrong? Do this. And as I mentioned, if somebody wants to insist that the Qur'an is a deception, then they have to show where the deception is. That is, it's a common theme that runs throughout the Qur'an, time and time again. If the Qur'an says, do they say such and such? Let them bring their proof. You are never supposed to say something unless you bring the evidence. Do they say the Qur'an is a deception? Let them bring their proof. Show me one deception. Where does it deceive me? Show me a lie that it has told if you say it's a deception. Otherwise, don't say that unless you show me. It's not good enough to tell me. Show me. Now, I know that some people, they have some ideas about where the Qur'an has deceived the Muslim, but this just shows they haven't examined it very carefully. Maybe the Muslim hasn't examined it very carefully, in fact. We'll find, as an example, some Christians will say, well, where the Qur'an deceives you is, it tells you about all sorts of good things that you should do, but it lies to you. It tells you God doesn't have a son. Is that a lie that the Qur'an has told us? Well, as a matter of fact, the Qur'an does not forbid the Muslim to believe that God has a son. It doesn't say, the reason God doesn't have a son is because it's forbidden. It doesn't say that. It tells you why he doesn't have a son. It gives you the reason. Because God doesn't have a son, because. If when you say son you mean this, that can't be. Do you mean this when you say son? That can't be. Do you mean that? It exhausts all of the meanings of son to say each one of these can't be true of God for these reasons. So it doesn't forbid you from believing it. It tells you why. It doesn't lie to you. There's even an interesting verse that says the Muslim is supposed to repeat, if God has a son, I will be the first to worship him. So it's not telling you he doesn't. It's saying if he does, you should worship him. But in fact, he doesn't because of these reasons. So again, the deception is not an easy thing to find. Stress that to people. If they want to say the book deceives, let them show the lie they're talking about, which is the false thing it says. And don't be misled onto this kind of thing. I had that talk in Minnesota in the U.S. a few months ago, and the man got very upset with a lot of things I had said, and so he started writing to me when I got home. And he said he had a whole book full of mistakes in the Qur'an. And he wasn't going to show me any of those because he said, you showed me mistakes in what I believe, but it doesn't change my belief. I still believe. He says, and you'd be the same way. If I showed you a mistake in what your book says, you'd still believe it. So I wrote him back to say, no, that's the difference between us. If you show me a mistake, I won't believe anymore. Because that's my attitude. I don't believe in spite of the difficulties. So I told him, I said, you pick the best mistake you can find. Tell me about it. What is the best mistake you can find? And what he wrote me was that the Qur'an says that Zechariah couldn't speak for 3 days, and the Bible says he couldn't speak for 9 months. He says, there's your mistake. Well, it's not so much a mistake as it is a matter of his book says this and my book says that. What remains to be proven is whose book is correct, which in fact can be demonstrated. But you see what I mean? It's not disagreement that is a problem. It's the actual proof. Somebody has to bring you the actual mistake, the case that will stand up in court to say this is false, but it's in your book. There's another way that a person can approach the Qur'an in examining the things that it has to say. I'll just illustrate this briefly. You can discover how surprising the book is by assembling what you might call a list of good guesses. See, the Qur'an talks about a lot of things. But if I can explain it to you the way it works in mathematics, when you make guesses, if you have two choices, one is right, one is wrong, and you close your eyes and make a choice, half the time you'll be right. So you have a 1 in 2 chance. You could pick the wrong one, you could pick the right one. So 1 time out of 2 you'll be right. But if you have 2 situations like that, I can be right or wrong about this, and I can be right or wrong about that, and I close my eyes and I guess like this, I'll only be right 1 time in 4. It becomes 1/2 times 1/2. That's because there's 3 ways to be wrong now. See, I can be wrong and wrong, or I can be wrong and right, or right and wrong. But the only way to be right is to be right and right. That's 1 out of the 4 possibilities. If you have 3 situations like that, and you make a blind guess 3 times, I'll guess this, and I'll guess that, and I'll guess this, you'll only be right 1 time in 8. So 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. Suppose that your options are 1 in 10. And you have another situation where there's 10 guesses, only 1 is right. And 10 guesses here, only 1 is right. If you close your eyes and pick 1, you're only going to be right 1 time in 100. It's 1/10 times 1/10. Because you've got 99 ways to be wrong and only 1 way to be right. So it is that if you draw up a list of the correct things the Qur'an has said, it becomes very unlikely that these are all good guesses. If it has millions of ways to be wrong, but it's always right, then it's unlikely that somebody was guessing. I'll give you 3 examples that already make the odds 1 in 8. The Qur'an says about bees. It speaks of the bee which leaves its home for gathering food. And it says in this ayah that this bee is female. Now a person might guess on that, say, well, the bees that you see flying around, they could be male, they could be female, I think I'll guess female. He has a 1 in 2 chance of being right. So happens the Qur'an is right. It also so happens that's not what most people believed at that time. Can you tell the difference between a male bee and a female bee? It takes a specialist to do that anyway. But the male bee never leaves the home to gather food.